Hey, Know Why listeners, welcome to the Know Why podcast. I tell you what, every day when I open up the news, I feel like I am living in yet another sci-fi novel or movie or universe or something, because I am just trying to keep up with how fast AI is advancing. And I'm honestly kind of surprised at some of the uses that people are pushing of AI, including First Lady Melania Trump. A couple weeks ago, you may have seen this. She hosted this event at the White House where she showcased a humanoid robot. She asked us to imagine a humanoid robot named Plato. The robot actually addressed the assembly, by the way, if that's not creepy enough for you. But here is what the First Lady said when she spoke to the group at her White House event. She said, Plato will provide a personalized experience, adaptive to the needs of each student. Plato is always patient and always available. And yes, if you haven't picked up on it, she was talking about a humanoid robot teacher/tutor, of course named Plato. She promised that very soon artificial intelligence will move from our mobile phones to humanoids that deliver utility. And she said that part of that utility is education. And humanoid robots like Plato would provide, quote, a more well-rounded lifestyle for our children, freeing up time for being with friends, playing sports, and developing interests beyond school. Now, if you've listened to the Know Why podcast for any amount of time, or you know anything about me, you probably already know where I'm going with this, which is to argue that humanoid robot teachers are a bad idea. But I don't want to just say, that's a bad idea, that's crazy, without actually articulating why. And that's what we're all about here, right? Is knowing why. This is the Know Why podcast after all. So I'm about to go through a few reasons why we shouldn't accept AI as replacements for human teachers. But before I do that, I do want to kind of flip the script for a minute and acknowledge that some of the things that she's talking about sound kind of nice. Let's keep in mind that right now, math, science, and reading scores for kids in the U.S. are at historic lows. So U.S. Educational achievement isn't really great right now. We also have to, for important context, keep in mind that the U.S. government is really in an AI arms race, especially with China. One of the things Melania Trump said is that her vision was to ensure that American children become the most technologically fluent and highly educated generation in the world. So, of course, I think the U.S. government and many people in the United States have an interest in making sure that the rising generations are well equipped for whatever our future might look like, including one that is highly advanced with artificial intelligence that influences everything from weaponry and warfare to, of course, education. And so we do have an interest in making sure that kids are prepared for that future. And we do know that education, as it's working right now, doesn't really seem to be working because a lot of kids are suffering low educational attainment and low scores. So some of the things that she talks about sound kind of nice, including the idea of a personalized instructor, optimized instruction that can be as quick or take as long as a student needs, which could ideally free the student up, as she said, for other interests, including sports and spending time with friends, being more well-rounded. She also said that a humanoid robot like Plato would have basically be like a full library of classical knowledge that is following you around all the time. You have instant access to the classics. You can ask about ancient philosophy. You can ask about Greek literature, and you have the answer right there. And apparently, according to her, this is supposed to increase students' critical thinking skills. So also her saying that Plato is always patient and always available. While that might sound a little bit dystopian, we also know that a lot of teachers are really struggling. They are in classrooms that are way too large, trying to manage far too many children to really give them the personalized instruction that they need. There's a teacher shortage, and we just know that as humans, sometimes it's hard, whether you're a teacher or a parent, to be patient all the time. So is this such a bad idea? Maybe we're just resisting it because we feel uncomfortable. Technology and change is all happening too fast. The idea of a robot teacher does sound kind of sci-fi or futuristic to us. And we should consider those things because nobody really wants to be accused of just being stuck in the past for no reason, right? Okay, well, I have some responses, and as I said, I do think that this is a bad idea. Now, I cannot help but come at this from a biblical perspective, and that's ultimately what I'm here to do. I want to equip you to think through this from a biblical understanding because that's where truth comes from. And even if you don't agree 100%, maybe you're not a Christian or you're on the fence, listen to the arguments that I'm about to lay out for why education is a specifically human endeavor. Even if you don't agree with me on the origins of some of the things I'm going to talk about, I think that anybody who does have a brain would acknowledge that the things I'm going to talk about are common to humans and they really impact how we learn. Again, research backs this up. So let's get into some of those arguments. First of all, I'm going to talk about how education is discipleship. So first, let's define discipleship. If you go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which I have pulled up right here, a disciple is one who accepts and assists in spreading the doctrines of another, such as in Christianity. Okay, so a lot of us, when we think about discipleship, we probably immediately go to Christianity, but somebody can be discipled in a tradition or doctrine that is not specific to Christianity. It just means that you are accepting, if you're a disciple, you are accepting that doctrine. If you are discipling somebody, then you're passing that on. I always like to look up the etymology of a word to get an even deeper understanding. And so the Old English word for disciple comes from a Latin origin, which means pupil, student, and follower. And it means someone who follows another for the purpose of learning. Okay, so we can see that definition right there, following another for the purpose of learning, is actually almost indistinguishable from what we would probably consider to be the definition of education. But let me go into a little bit more detail about, especially from a Christian perspective, education is discipleship. We might tend to split this up in our minds and think of education as a typical classroom, a college campus, academic work, test, things like that. And when we hear discipleship, maybe we think of Bible study, Sunday school, going to church on Sunday, reading your Bible, which all of those things are true, but those are kind of compartmentalized and honestly a little bit more modern understanding of what education and discipleship are. So if we're coming at this from a Christian worldview and we acknowledge that God is the creator of everything, then that means learning about everything, not just the Bible, but molecules, galaxies, languages, music, arts, science, history. Learning about all of that is actually a sacred act because we're learning about the world that God created. And so as Christians, we should think of education as an entirely Christian endeavor. When you are learning about the planets, when you're learning about fossils, when you're learning about grammar and how to diagram a sentence and language, or you're learning about what people in the past did, you may not be thinking, oh, I'm discipling right now, or I'm being discipled, but you're learning about God's creation. And so every part of education is an opportunity to teach about the world that God created. So that in itself is a sacred act. But how we educate also really matters and presents many opportunities for discipleship. The truth of the matter is, if you are a teacher, you are a leader. And this doesn't matter if you're a teacher in a traditional sense, like in a classroom and you've got 20 or 30 kids that you're teaching a subject to, or if you are just a parent or somebody who is an authority figure over somebody who is younger than you or learning something that you are sharing. You are in your teacher capacity in a position of authority. So you cannot help but set an example. That example might be positive or negative, but for good or bad, you are discipling the person that you're teaching. Now, for teachers, we obviously hope that they're going to set good examples. We hope that they're going to show students what it means to work diligently, to overcome obstacles, to have integrity and humility, and as Christians, live your life in a way that honors the Lord. But we know that teachers are going to model behavior one way or the other, and that students are going to emulate it. So not only in the very act and definition of education are we honoring God, who is the creator of the universe, how we educate, we're also discipling either for good or for bad. And so we need to realize that education is discipleship. Let's bring it back to robots or AI. Discipleship is a task given to human beings in the Bible, because if you are teaching something, if you are discipling somebody in what is true, you can't really understand or know or comprehend what's true, what's worthy of discipling somebody in, unless you are a human and you have been given that capacity for reason that reflects God's own capacity. The Bible says we're made in the image of God. That means we reflect Him both in our capacity to reason and think rationally, and also in our capacity to relate. And I'll talk about relationship in just a minute. But robots can't disciple. And discipleship is a big responsibility. Like I mentioned earlier, having a teacher that's always patient and always available sounds really nice, because as humans, sometimes maybe we feel bad because we can't always be patient with our kids. Or as teachers, maybe we feel like, oh man, I wasn't patient with my students today. So discipleship is a heavy responsibility, and we can set examples for either good or bad, but it's a responsibility that was first given to us as humans. So if we just say that we're going to give that to a robot so that we don't have to work hard at being the best that we can be, the best example we can be, we're shirking our responsibility, honestly. So education is discipleship. Discipleship is for humans. And if education is discipleship, then that means robots can't do it. So let's move on, though. Education is relationship. And this is another thing that's really important for us to understand, and there's research behind this too. So let me just read a little bit that I've done here. There is cognitive research showing that students learn best in the context of quality relationships. I think this is common sense, but just in case you were wondering, there are studies that have backed this up, that when students, for instance, feel valued by their teacher, they actually learn a lot better. And we see this even from infancy, how well babies do when they are in the care of a loved one, especially a parent, versus when they are being cared for by somebody who is a stranger or doesn't really have a vested interest in them. They learn so much more, their brain grows so much more when they're in the care of somebody that actually loves them and that they feel attached to. So this isn't an accident. And again, anybody who's ever worked with kids or been a teacher, you probably know that when you have a connection with your students, like everything goes so much smoother. They trust you more. There is an openness there. When the emotions are open, the mind is open. So again, that's not an accident. We were designed, again, being designed in the image of God from a Christian standpoint. We reflect His ability to have relationship, and not just ability, but fundamental need to be in relationship. So we're designed to learn in relationship because we're designed to be in relationship. We're not designed to be isolated. So why would it make sense for our brains, a fundamental part of who we are as human beings, our minds, why would it make sense for those to grow and learn in an environment that humans weren't even designed to be in? And so obviously the relationship between teacher and student matters, but so does the context of learning, including being in a community of a bunch of people, including people that we don't agree with. So I'm going to talk about classical education for a minute, but again, I think you'll recognize some common sense applications here. So in the classical education tradition, dialectic is the process of forming a cohesive worldview. This is a tradition going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, okay? So the dialectic is how you take different pieces of seemingly disjointed information and you form them together to actually gain a complete understanding. So typically, if you are educating a child according to the classical tradition, they'll start with the grammar stage, which isn't just English language grammar, but what that means is the building blocks of learning a bigger subject matter. So in grammar, as we think of it, we're learning about parts of speech, right? What are nouns? What are verbs? What are adverbs? What do you need to put a sentence together so that you can eventually read and write and understand the English language? Well, grammar is the same thing in other areas as well. So when children are very, very young, They will memorize things in their grammar stage. They will memorize facts related to a lot of different subjects. Even if they don't comprehend what it means just yet, they are learning bits of information. And as they get a little bit older, think about when kids start asking why all the time, or they start getting really argumentative, okay? Maybe like 9, 10, 11, something like that. They're transitioning into the dialectic stage. That's where their brains are really growing and they're leaping in their capacity to understand and comprehend. And so the dialectic is a process of harmonization of, again, all those different pieces of information to know what it actually means. And I think if you've ever studied, think about times where you've been in school and you're learning different facts and you're learning different things, but then all of a sudden it clicks, is what we often say in our language today, is like something clicks and you're like, oh yeah, it all makes sense. I see the big picture now. That's what the dialectic process is. It's when you take all these little bits of information that you've learned and it starts to click. Okay, here's the thing. That click can only happen if you've gone through the process of wrestling, both with the material, the information itself, but also intellectually with other people. So you can probably recall, if you think back to high school or if you went to college, those debates where if you are maybe in a literature class or a history class or philosophy and you're talking about something controversial and the teacher asks a question and 2 hands shoot up and it's the 2 people that have opposite viewpoints and everybody's like, oh, I know this is about to be a good debate, right? Okay, that's part of the dialectic process, or the typical kind of cliche on college campuses where people are walking around, sophomores, the wise fools, and they're having these debates about grand ideas in their dorm rooms or in the cafeteria. And sometimes they're saying things that are kind of outlandish and crazy, but that's not just a bug, okay? That's not just a cliche or an annoying quirk of people who think they're too smart. That's actually a really important part of the educational process. In fact, those things, those debates, those disagreements, those questions, those long conversations into the night where you're testing out different theories and ideas and you're talking them through with somebody, especially somebody who disagrees with you, those are just as important to the educational process, if not more so, than textbooks and lectures and the information, the bits of information that you're receiving, because it is helping you to, again, gain that comprehensive understanding. Think about it. Would you understand something better if you have wrestled with it in your mind, debated it with somebody, looked at both sides of an issue? Even on debate teams, sometimes people will have to study both sides of an argument, even one they personally disagree with, and they have to prepare at a moment's notice whenever the judge decides which side they're going to argue one side or the other. So they have to know both sides. Well, do you think that people who do that kind of thinking and that kind of preparation and process understand an issue better than somebody who read an article on Wikipedia or even a chapter in a textbook or asked ChatGPT? Yeah, the people who have wrestled with the issue, debated it with other people, looked at both sides and all the different facets, they're going to have a greater understanding. It actually is going to click in their minds, not necessarily in the mind of somebody who just read the information and got a very surface level explanation. And if we want to look at the Bible, Jesus actually did this in his earthly ministry. Think about how he talked with his disciples, or even you can see this pattern in all of Scripture actually, but you really see it in Jesus' earthly ministry too, where he asks a lot of questions. Even when his disciples are like, they come to him and they say, Lord, some people say that you're Elijah, some people say that you're Moses, some people say that you're this. Who are you? And he says, who do you say that I am? And he doesn't even answer, but he allows his disciples to wrestle. You see some arguments between disciples in the Gospels, and Jesus allows them to go through that process, often for a long time before he actually reveals a complete answer to them. And that is because he was exemplifying that dialectic process where we have to wrestle. Another example of this is Socratic dialogue, which you've probably heard of, which is the method of teaching where you ask questions. So if a student asks you a question and you're in the teaching position, instead of just giving them the answer like, oh, it's this, you can say, well, what do you think? And what that does is it causes the student to stop and consider the information that he already has and then try to work it together until he understands something. So that's all really important, okay? Now, if we take what is kind of a pragmatic view, which honestly really prevails in discussions of AI, especially people who are promoting it or in favor of using it for things like education, it views education as a utility. That's what Melania Trump said. Even, I believe it was Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, which has ChatGPT. He recently said that he sees a future where intelligence is just viewed as a utility that you can pay for like you pay for parking out of a parking meter, that these AIs are going to have all the intelligence and we can just use what we need when we need it instead of actually having that intelligence ourselves. So if you view education as a utility, then those debates, those cringy arguments in classrooms, those long question and answer conversations probably seem inefficient. A lot of people may even think that they waste time. Why would you want to do that when you can optimize education and just ask a robot who knows the answer and get the answer you need and move on with your day? Well, it's because you're not actually learning that way. Now, all of this is important because it happens in the context of community, of relationship, including with people who don't agree with you. Echo chambers don't sharpen the mind, but the Bible says iron sharpens iron. We're supposed to be wrestling intellectually with other people. And that friction is a feature, not a bug, because we learn better and our own mind is sharpened when it comes up against the friction of somebody else's perspective. Now, a robot can pretend to have another perspective, but we already know from the research we're seeing about large language models that they're extremely sycophantic. And even if they get better, where a humanoid robot teacher like Plato would be able to give you, here are some alternative perspectives to the theory that you just asked me about, it's not actually going to be unique. It's not true friction of another person's emotion-driven, passion-based, unique perspective that now you're going to have to argue against. That is what is required for greater understanding. That happens in real community with real people, in real relationships, even with intellectual opponents. And that is something that AI can never provide, which is another reason why AI can never truly educate. Okay, but another point. Let's just assume that you don't really care about those arguments, what I would say the biblical arguments, or you can even say the Christian humanist arguments, because even if you're not a Christian, I think a lot of people who consider themselves to be humanists, they understand what is unique and special about human beings, they would acknowledge that, yeah, okay, relationship is required for learning, discipleship is a form of education, those things are really important, those are the things that humans deliver, and it's more of a philosophical take on why education requires relationship and why education is a form of discipleship. But let's say we don't care about any of that. You're coming at this from the completely pragmatic, utilitarian view, and you say, well, so what about being a human? I don't really care. I'm not a philosophy person, but is this going to get results? Could it cause test scores to go up? If that's all you really care about, let's look at that argument. In short, the answer is probably not. And I would say definitely not, but for the sake of just being careful, I'm going to say probably not, because we already have some evidence for why this wouldn't work very well. And so let's look at the practicality of it alone. Let's talk about education technology for a minute. Over the past decade or so, we really saw a huge push for education technology around the world, pushing things like all these devices. If you're a parent, you know, the Chromebooks, the tablets, the advanced technology in classrooms, and this is going to be so key, and we need more of this, and this is going to help students, it's going to revolutionize education. Well, long story short, it didn't. It failed. As we know, test scores are at an all-time low in the United States. So here is a headline from The Economist earlier this year in 2026. EdTech is profitable. It is also mostly useless. Here's another quote from the article. Although edtech companies tout huge learning gains, independent research has made clear that technology rarely boosts learning in schools and often impairs it. So why are we still using it? Why are people still pushing it? Because of money. It's profitable. So companies, edtech companies, are pushing their products on states, on school districts, on school administrators, on teachers themselves. Here's another quote from The Economist. In 2024, American schools spent $30 billion on education technology. Globally, it's a $165 billion industry. Okay, no wonder people are pushing it. There's a lot of money behind it. Now get this when it comes to AI. Tech investors are pouring so much money into AI. Between 2013 and 2024, $1.6 trillion has been privately invested into AI. No wonder they're pushing AI in education. They are pushing it because there's money behind it. And everyone's like, look at all this money that's being invested into AI. Now we got to use it for everything. All right? Maybe we'll learn our lesson from EdTech. By the way, I think it's ironic that at a time when countries around the world are banning social media for students largely under 16 is the biggest trend, and multiple states in the United States have passed some sort of cell phone restriction, including bell-to-bell bans where you cannot use a cell phone while you're at school because they've seen the harmful effects on education. At the same time, they are still pushing EdTech. They're still pushing AI and other forms of technology and screens. So you're taking away the little thing, but you're keeping all the other stuff and adding new stuff as well. Maybe we'll catch up. Maybe we'll integrate these different bits of information until it all clicks and we see that maybe technology isn't the answer, but it's hard when you're going up against trillions of dollars worth of industry that are pushing these things as products that are supposedly helpful. Okay, just something to consider. Now, again, to play devil's advocate, what if someone says, hey, EdTech is different, AI is different, you can't really compare those because they're not the same thing. Well, let's look at AI specifically. Research is showing that AI usage actually dumbs you down, and I'm not just saying that. This is from the New York Times just a week or so ago. I'm going to read this quote. A study from January based on surveys and interviews with more than 600 participants revealed a significant negative correlation between frequent AI tool usage and critical thinking abilities. I'll quote this, or I'll link this article in the show notes, by the way. Another recent study, which tracked the brain activity of research subjects who were writing with the help of large language models, found that brain connectivity systematically scaled down with the amount of external support. Okay, brain connectivity systematically scaled down with the amount of external support. In other words, when you're depending on something else to do your thinking for you, you're getting dumb. It's not that hard. It's kind of common sense. Like if you're not using your muscles to do something in your physical body, then those muscles are going to get weaker. Your brain's a muscle. So if you're not using it and you're depending on something else, a tool to do that for you instead of using your own muscle, your muscle's going to atrophy. It's going to get weaker. People have been saying this, but people use it anyway and pretend like it's not happening, even though it is. So if you take EdTech's proven failure in classrooms, the trend we're already seeing to get cell phones out of schools, not just in the United States, but across the world, plus AI's observable dumbing down effects on humans who use it, we should all pause before replacing human educators with AI, whether it's a humanoid robot or a chatbot. Even if you don't care about the humanistic arguments or the theological arguments or the philosophical arguments about being human, even if you just care about the actual test score results, it's not working. Why would we think that it's all of a sudden going to work whenever you put it in a human shape, which is what Melania Trump said? It's just not going to. So again, back to her stated vision. She wants American children to be the most educated in the world, the most technologically fluent. So these are not bad goals, okay? And I will just point you to a previous interview that I did with Emily Harrison. I actually did an interview with her last year on AI and education, so I'll link it here because it's really good to go back. Again, so much has changed, but the basic principles of what she was saying are still true. And one of the things that she talks about is that we mistake growing up with technology all around us and using it all the time with actually being technological experts. Like she'll say, people often say, well, Gen Z or Gen Alpha are digital natives. Like they're way more, they understand technology better than we do because they were raised with it. And she's saying that's actually not true because they aren't really learning true skills. I'm not saying every school, but a lot of schools, according to what she was saying, they don't actually teach typing. So kids may know how to swipe on a screen, but their critical thinking is suffering, their attention span is suffering, and they don't even know how to use a word processor or build a spreadsheet or type correctly. So I'm not saying that it would be an exact one-to-one comparison with AI usage, but I've seen a lot of arguments saying that parents and teachers should start encouraging students to use AI now because they need to know how to use it. And I think we could make a similar mistake, because basically using AI now is like learning how to give it the right prompts. But we're seeing that when people do that and they're using it as a thinking partner, which is what people are saying you should encourage students to do, is use it as a thinking partner. When they're offloading that thinking in their own brain, they're getting dumber. So wouldn't it be better to actually learn how to think for yourself? If we really want to be the most educated generation of Americans in the future in a really critical time in history, then we should go to time-tested methods that have actually produced people who can think on their own, who can read full books without having a breakdown because their attention span is so short because of the way that they were raised. We should raise people who do know how to critically think, who don't need a robot library to follow them around or an AI parking meter to buy intelligence, but have intelligence themselves. That's who we should be raising. That's what we should be focusing on. So just real quick, I'll give a few options that we might want to consider. And I'm not going to get into all of these in detail because I don't have time. The episode's already running long and I could talk about AI for a long time, but you might get tired of me if I keep doing that. But just for food for thought, if you are a parent or you're thinking about having kids in the future and what kind of education that you might want to offer them, okay, I'm going to say homeschooling. I can already hear a bunch of people saying, well, that's not going to work for me, and I don't know, and all these concerns. That's fine. We can do an episode on homeschooling specifically in the future, but just hear me out from a Christian perspective, assuming that you don't already have a bunch of problems with homeschooling as an idea. The Bible tells parents to disciple their children. That's very clear, okay? We know that we're supposed to be the ones that are teaching our children about the Lord and about biblical truth. Now, if education is discipleship, as I talked about a few minutes ago, that means education is the primary responsibility of the parents, okay? And when you are discipling in biblical instruction and talking about biblical truth, it's a lot easier to do that if it's integrated with discipleship in every area as well. Remember, everything that we learn is a part of glorifying God because we're learning about His world and His universe. And so as parents, we need to take that seriously and realize that, okay, education and discipleship aren't two separate boxes. They're the same thing. And that's our responsibility. Now, when it comes to those benefits that Mrs. Trump talked about, okay, personalized instruction, optimized learning, people that are or instructors that are more motivated to be patient and available, homeschooling by nature typically offers all of that because you're able to, as a parent, your child better than anyone, you're able to personalize and optimize their learning. And no, you're not perfect, but parents a lot of times are more motivated to give their children the patience and attention that they require rather than somebody who doesn't. Now, I have lots of people that I know in my life and love very dearly who are teachers. I myself have taught many other students in the past. So I'm not saying that teachers can't have loving and caring and patient relationships with their students. But I'm just arguing that from a biblical perspective, parents are their children's primary educators, which is a reason why people, if you can, should consider homeschooling as an option. Now, I know that it's also not an option, not realistic, and not the best choice for every family. So you can still say, yes, I am the primary educator of my children, and I believe that you can do this and at the same time partner with other people, other wonderful teachers, other schooling environments to aid in your child's education. You shouldn't, in your mind, think, well, I'm relinquishing that responsibility. You still should be the one overseeing your children's education and making sure that there are no gaps and continuing to educate them at home. But if you can't officially homeschool, you can still take on that role and partner with others, but you can do so carefully. There are more options now than ever before for people to find a school option that is right for their family, that aligns with their values, especially as school choice movements take over around the United States. There's just a lot more freedom and options for people than there have been in the past. Everything from hybrid schools to charter schools, school districts where you have mobility to move around. And a lot of people have problems with school choice. And so if that's you, or even if it's not, regardless of what you think of school choice, you should be involved in your child's school. You should care about your local school district, because those are the people that are going to be educating your children and your neighbors and your friends and the next generation. And so you should be involved. And if you have problems, then you should go and address them and investigate them yourself. I think that something else to consider for parents is look at what the research is actually saying about education technology, about screens in schools, about AI usage. You see some schools that are going extreme. Maybe they don't have humanoid robots yet, but they're adopting like AI chatbots as teachers. Look up Alpha School in Texas. And look at the research, though, on how AI and screens and technology in general are affecting education. Again, look at Emily Harrison, look at Emily Churkin on Substack, look at Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation. There are so many people, scholars, who are researching this. Jean Twenge, and they're talking about the impacts of smartphones, screens, social media, technology, AI on education, on kids' well-being, and it's not good. So you can also look for schools that are doing things the old-fashioned way, because while some schools are rushing to embrace the shiny new thing that has all the money behind it, other schools are actually taking a reverse course, including some public school districts that I've heard about, which I think is awesome, that are returning to pen and paper in the classroom. And they're making kids do things the old-fashioned way because they're realizing that research shows that that actually is more beneficial for helping kids learn things. So take all that into consideration when you're choosing your children's school. And back to classical education, I'm a big fan of it. I'm actually studying it in a master's program. That's how I educate my kids. But regardless of where your kids go to school, you can apply the same mindsets in your family life, even as an adult, okay? So here are some ways you can do that. If you do have young children, focus on memorization with them when they're young, whether they're doing that in their school or not, whether you're homeschooling or not. When they're little, their brains are like sponges. So memorize poems, memorize passages of scripture, memorize facts, have them memorize things. That is going to strengthen their brain so much while they're young. And then as they grow, apply the dialectic like we talked about earlier. Encourage them to have tough questions. Encourage them to debate. Intentionally expose them to worldviews that are different than your own, and have them practice comparing different worldviews and understanding different things, making lists of pros and cons and comparisons and understanding, so that they can actually form a worldview that is truly their own, that they really understand and comprehend, and aren't just kind of gathering what they're being given passively without really learning to question what it means. And then encourage them to articulate their beliefs winsomely and eloquently. Have them practice doing that. You can give your kids additional assignments if you think that they need something that they're not getting in their school. And you can do this yourself as well. You can challenge yourself to say, I'm going to debate. I'm going to wrestle with something. I'm going to try to get together with friends over coffee and have a book club going, or pick a controversial topic and have a rule that everybody has to be civil and it can't get personal, but even take turns debating different sides. Do that to sharpen each other. That's so important, and it's so stimulating. And make sure that no AI is allowed in your conversations. And read. When your kids are little, read to them out loud all the time. Even when they're older, read out loud to them. When they're able to read, have them read. And read the old books, read the classics. It's called a great conversation for a reason. When you read the classic books, the books that have shaped centuries and centuries of thinkers, why would we think that we can just change it all and do it all better just because we have some new technological tools and our intellectual capacities are tanking? So do things the old-fashioned way. Go old school a little bit and read some old books. But I'm going to wrap it up by saying this. In the coming years and months, there's likely going to be an even stronger push for AI use in the classroom and in all different areas of life. Again, we've seen that in just a short amount of time, it raised $1.6 trillion in private investment. So we know that it is going to be pushed. If for no other reasons, financial reasons. And a lot of people truly believe that AI has an important part to play in our future and a positive role. I'm more skeptical in general about AI, but specifically with education, I just think we have to draw the line. With certain things, we are going to have to say, no, we're not outsourcing this to AI. This is for humans from a theological perspective, from a humanistic perspective, from a philosophical perspective. If we don't guard the things that are given distinctly and uniquely and specifically to humans to do, and we offload those, then yeah, we will be replaced by AI. We will be replaced by robots. And this isn't necessarily even about job protection. This is about a protection of what it means to be human. And so if you were weirded out by the AI robot teacher that Melania Trump was showcasing at an earlier event a few weeks ago at the White House, but you didn't exactly know why it gave you the ick, I hope that this episode has given you some points to articulate. And if you disagree, I at least hope that you will spend some time maybe talking to yourself in the shower or writing down some notes by hand in a journal, not on ChatGPT, to articulate your arguments why you think I'm wrong. And I'd love to hear them in the comments. At least you'll be sharpening your brain if you take the time to write out why you think I'm wrong, and we can have a good old-fashioned debate about it. Let's keep ourselves human. Let's keep our minds sharp. And I'll see you next week on the Know Why podcast.